a story with you, and I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts that I've had. And my thoughts are not necessarily kid oriented. My thoughts are being shared with the community. And hang on a second. So here I go. So this week, the public execution of George Floyd has ignited a righteous anger that's rooted in love that says, no, the line stops here. There is an anger that moves us to action, and that anger is different from rage. Rage is a response, it's an emotion that we have when we feel cornered and don't know where to go. It comes out of fear. But anger that moves us to action is what we are experiencing right now. In Levin, we have an equity and diversity and inclusion statement that says, recognizing our complicity in racist systems that oppress, harm, and steal life, we commit to transforming ourselves and to taking actions that resist, disrupt, and heal these broken systems, because all life depends on it. And this week, we've really begun to see that that is true. In order to be transformed, though, we have to start with truth-telling. And here's a truth-telling. The relationship that I have with this community is complex. I am an African-American female who is co-director of a multicultural, multilingual Levin community, through which the primary Eurocentric congregation of Salt and Light Lutheran is nested and does its good work. There's a lot of complexity in that, folks. And here's another truth, that the system of white supremacy does exist, but it doesn't exist in isolation. People are required to execute policies and power in order for this system to function, and we all have a role to play in this system, and we all have a role to play in dismantling it. But it can't be done in isolation. And as I was thinking about that today, David Balch was scheduled to preach today. And given the circumstances, there were some who said, is he the voice that we really need to hear today? And I thought about it and I said, yes, yes. Because the power of patriarchy and racism in the Western Christian church has long been associated with white cisgender males. So it's okay for the truth to start there, for the truth telling to start there. But also in our community, story is very important. Story in our community is what we're founded on. We start building relationships of trust through our stories, but story is also where we find the fire and the energy to move ourselves into action. So I was moved to ask David today not to preach, but to share his story and to have a conversation with me about his story and around how patriarchy and racism has its place in Christianity. So today I ask you to listen with an open heart, with a heart of love. I ask you to resist judgment, to listen with curiosity, to pay attention to the emotions and the feelings that rise within you, to breathe in those feelings, to sit with them, and then to release them with compassion for yourself and for all of us who are listening in today. And before David shares his story, though, I'm going to ask you to mute your mics, make sure your mics are muted as we lift our voices, and we're going to sing our gospel acclamation. And then David is going to read our gospel lesson for the day, and then he will share his story with us.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Matthew 28, 16 to 20. The 11 made their way to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had summoned them. At the sight of the risen Christ, they fell down in homage, though some doubted what they were seeing. Jesus came forward and addressed them in these words: "All authority has been given to me, both in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of Abba, God, and of the only begotten, and of the Holy Spirit. Teach them to carry out everything I have commanded you, and know that I am with you always, even to the end of the world." La palabra de Dios. LaVeta, you have questions, right? Or do you want me to ask them?
You're muted.
I'm muted?
No, you're fine, David. David,
yeah.
Go ahead and share your story first.
Oh, yes, okay. This is obvious to all of us, an African-American moment, not a moment for white males. I am following LaVeta's lead, and as asked, sharing the story. It's about my teenage years in Pampa, Texas, near Amarillo. On May 25th, a Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he died. Deep feelings have been aroused by that event: sadness, grief, anger, perhaps a flicker of hope that this time laws might actually be changed, also in Oregon. In this crisis, Juan Carlos advises that it would be good to begin with confession and forgiveness, asking forgiveness. This narrative of my teenage life, growing up in Pampa, is a confession of guilt. Most in this community would agree that we were born into a racist North American society. And it was and still is intense in Texas. My story illustrates that sin is not only individual, but is also political. This story is about my family. Mom, dad, brothers, and a sister, all of whom I love. The time and place in which I was born was a ranch and farm on the Texas plains. We were all very religious, which meant that we drove from the farm into church 3 times a week. Not only church, we had the Bible, and we in the Church of Christ had the one correct interpretation of that book. We didn't know the Bible better than Trump. We opened it up 3 times a week. We were so busy going to church that my family drove from our farm right through the southern part of Pampa, which I confess I did not realize was African American until years later. We continued to the north white side of town. Our town was not only religious, you will also believe that this Texas town was really into sports. 3 times when I was a junior and in high school, the basketball team in our small town was one of only 4 teams in the whole state that competed for the state championship. Again, only years later, I realized that there was a black high school in Pampa, which our white high school never played. Nor did our white Church of Christ ever worship with the African American churches of Christ in town. You will not be surprised that the civil rights movement passed us by. The church in which I was raised was not only racist, the way we read the Bible suppressed women. My brilliant mom finished high school and taught ladies' Bible class the rest of her life. She spent the life reading the Bible, so does her son. She had a mind as good as her brother, Lloyd, who finished a PhD in organic chemistry at the University of California, Berkeley, and became chair of the science division at Pepperdine University. The way we read the Bible in Pampa, during her 92 years, she was never allowed to speak in worship. Our church was racist and patriarchal, based, we claimed, on the Bible. My conclusion, my confession, is that many, many Christian churches, both Roman Catholic and evangelical Protestant, are patriarchal, that is, repress women. Evangelical white Protestant, in which I was raised, is also largely racist. We Christians have much to confess around our contribution to the national crisis at the moment over racism and patriarchy. We have often repressed people of color and women as we worship God. In the mid-1960s, I chose to move to New York City and attend Union Theological Seminary in New York. That was the beginning of my personal and professional conversion. My own repentance, angry at my mother being silenced, which I didn't really tune into that anger until that I was that angry years later, is just spent 4.5 decades as a professional New Testament scholar doing a revisionist interpretation of the Bible around patriarchy and ethnicity. My confession includes the awareness that when I was a teenager, I was absolutely blind to the racism and patriarchy in my church, in school, and town. Yeah.
David, thank you for sharing that. And you know, for everyone, David and I talked a couple of days ago. And when he shared that story with me, I was kind of blown away at the fact that he lived in a town that that you never had to interact with people of color.
No.
I wasn't blown away by the fact that patriarchy was embedded in the church. That didn't surprise me. And yet, I also, when we were talking, you shared that you were in that town until you left and went to New York City. And when you went to New York City, that you had contact, and I'm just going to say contact with people, with African Americans. And I'm curious, how was that for you? How was that?
Well, so you're finished with the question? Yeah.
Yeah.
So part of my confession is it took me years for some of this to sink in. So I'll describe that. I am not trying to explain it, right? So when I was in New York, it was from 1966 to 68. Those are rather important years in the civil rights movement. When I was at Union Seminary on the edge of Harlem, the Black Panthers shut down Columbia University, Black Panthers and the students. And so I watched Black Panthers act. And one of them was Angela Davis. I heard that she was, in jail. Just so this will skip around. Part of my story is that, 25 years later, I took a daughter to school at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She took me to class, and there were, 100 students trying to get into this class. And that's the first time I saw Angela Davis again. She was my daughter's teacher. So I would describe my history as a series of shocks, from small town where I thought the world was White Church of Christ and White Baptists, and the Baptists were all wrong. That was to New York City. And here, LaVeta, not only New York, I want to add a short section about Germany. That's, my education includes New York and Germany. So I spent 2 years in New York, 2 years in Germany, where also, not the Black Panthers, but that was called the Baader-Meinhof-Gang, shut down universities. And my teacher there was Ernst Käsemann, who was a young pastor earlier. When he was a pastor, that church excommunicated 45 Nazis, kicked them out of the church. And somehow the police in town respected the church enough that in that case, they let it happen.
What happened with the church in New York City when the Black Panthers were there, though?
Yeah. Okay. A number of the churches around Columbia University were asked by the police, and the churches agreed to let the police use their sanctuaries as staging grounds for the police. So the police emerged from the churches to beat the students with their staffs.
And that's when we look back at the 60s, we say, wow. And yet in the context of the 60s, we realize that there was this civil rights movement. But for me, when you shared that with me, I thought your experience of that is so different from my experience. My experience of the 60s was, I was in high school, and the first 2 years of my high school life, I was at a white Christian evangelical high school. And in 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, it was a Thursday night, and that Friday morning when I went to school, no one was mourning his death. Oh. Someone was saying maybe he was a communist. And but I had one friend. I thought I had many friends, but as it turned out, I had one friend at the school who totally understood the humanity and the graveness of what had happened. And that friend was also the son of a white Baptist minister, but he realized that he was grappling with his own identity of being gay. And so we made a pact that we weren't going to return to that school, and we didn't.
Wow.
But the thing I'm saying is my experience of the 60s was I was a Christian, and yet within Christianity, there was this mindset of segregation and racism. And I found it really hard to understand how is it that the Christian church, the Bible that I was reading, where Jesus was saying, love your neighbor and love God, how did the church get to that point where the message of Jesus turned into the message of support the police as they brutalize people?
Yeah.
How did that happen? I'm asking you that because you're a New Testament scholar. So
okay.
I want some framework here, some background here.
I can make some comments about that. That is, the early church was a martyr church, a minority group in the Roman Empire. And their belief was so intense. They lived in the Roman Empire, and the primary symbol of power in the Roman Empire were amphitheaters. That empire imported lions and panthers and elephants, and they executed criminals in the amphitheater. And so when people would not worship the emperor, they tossed them in the amphitheater. And Christians, most astounding stories are about some of the women, who were not, I mean, that was a very patriarchal, hierarchical society, but some of the women led. And so in the early 300s, the person who wanted to be emperor, Constantine, was so impressed by Christians willing to face death that he became a Christian. He wanted soldiers for his army. He did not read the Sermon on the Mount. He did not read, blessed are your enemies and blessed are the poor. He saw Christians who were women included, who were so powerful that they were willing to face death in their confession of Christ. So with Constantine, the church became an imperial religion and staffed the army. And, for 2 millennia, it has been an imperial religion mostly. Could give you other examples, but Constantine did not, read Jesus' sayings when he became Christian. That's not what happened.
So the Christian church moved from being a church of the martyred, to the church of power.
To the church of persecutors, yeah.
Yeah, and that makes sense then to me, because when I think about how our country was founded, we say that our country was founded on Christian ideals, and yet those Christian ideals made it possible for my ancestors to be enslaved. It made it possible for the genocide of the native peoples. And so in the Roman culture, if people didn't worship the emperor, then they were executed. And when Christianity then became the religion of power, if people didn't worship, or if it was perceived that they were not Christian people, then their life wasn't valued either then.
Right, and you mentioned slaves, which I could comment on that. People who immigrate to a society gradually acculturate, become more and more like the society. As a church lived in the Roman Empire, they took on Roman values.
Mm-hmm.
That happens already in the New Testament. I do not worship a book. As a Christian, I do not worship a book. I am a follower of Jesus, not a book. Mm-hmm. So as the church adapted to living in Rome, they lived in house churches. And Greeks and Romans had ethics around how to live in a house. Let me see if I can explain this really quickly. In Colossians, and so there are books by Paul, the apostle, and books by his students that claim to be by Paul but are not. Colossians and Ephesians contain what are called household codes. They have 3 pairs. Wives are supposed to be submissive, and then there's a section about husbands. Slaves are supposed to be submissive, and then there's a section about masters. Children are to be submissive, and it says fathers, not parents. So there are 3 pairs. And the focus on all those 3 relationships is on subordination, obedience. The only place in the whole ancient world those 3 pairs occurs is in Aristotle's book on politics. That is, as the church lived in the Roman Empire and learned how to be Roman, they took on that household ethic, which include women being quiet and slaves being subordinate. I wish Colossians and Ephesians were not in the New Testament. But in other words, we can read Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. We can also read a very Roman ethic in the New Testament itself. Mm-hmm. So for me, all the New Testament is not on the same level, not at all.
So as an African-American female, I experience patriarchy, and I also experience racism in this faith that I have that follows the way of Jesus. It's very paradoxical to live in that. And I look at our community of Leaven community, and when I see our community, I see many of us who are wounded by having lived in this paradox of racism, patriarchy, and yet as a community of Salt and Light Lutheran, we have said that we don't believe that, and that we are wanting to disrupt that, and that we choose to welcome the stranger and welcome the foreigner and welcome. That's what we've said we do. But I often wonder, how are we really doing that? I'm not asking you that question now, I'm asking that question in general. What are the ways that are in us that block us, or that make us feel small, or that keep us from welcoming? What are our fears that keep us from welcoming? Or what are the things that we don't even notice about ourselves that keep us from welcoming, or that impede our ability to be as welcoming as we want to be? I wonder about that. I know that, you know, in meditation yesterday, we were sharing, and someone was sharing about how unconsciously, when they walk down the street and they see a Black man, how unconsciously they realize within them there's this dis-ease, this discomfort, and then they feel really bad about that feeling, because they know that there's no reason for it, but they feel bad about it. And then they sit with it and they say, just because the culture that I'm living in tells me that I should feel dis-ease, I don't have to. And they move past that, and they say, I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to break that dis-ease that I'm feeling. And I was thinking for myself, how does it feel for me? What is it in me that I feel dis-ease with when I am in places where I notice difference? And I was wondering, and my question to you, David, was, when you went to New York, how were you impacted by that? How did the difference of that impact you?
I think of two responses, LaVeta. I've already said that I learned very slowly coming out of Pampa. I've lived a number of places in the world pursuing this New Testament scholarship. And I haven't, every place I've lived, there's ethnic conflict. In New York, you know, the Spanish Harlem, Black Harlem, white, so-called white part. I moved to Germany, there's a huge Turkish population in Berlin, and very significant, Muslim Turkish mostly. I lived in Israel. I don't have to describe those ethnic differences. In Argentina, there's a difference between the so-called Latinos, they're largely immigrants from Germany and Italy, and the Aztec Maya. So my conclusion, LaVeta, is we're a very anxious species. I'm somehow nervous about people who are different from me. And you can fill in the blank. If it's gender, economic class, ethnicity, it can be white and black, it can be white and brown, you know, it can be brown in Argentina and darker brown with Native Americans. And that's true in the ancient world around the Roman Empire, you know. Jews talked about Gentiles. Greeks talked about barbarians. I think the task is to overcome our own anxieties. It's not just in one place. Now I forgot, I had a second thought, but anyhow, I thought, but in New York, I first realized, I didn't in Panther or Abilene. In New York, on the edge of Harlem, it sank into me that there are ethnic differences. But you asked me another question, and then yeah.
Well, when you realized there were ethnic differences, how did that impact you?
Yeah, well, in those days, and for much of my life, I've lived in my head. So one way it impacted me is I have spent 50 years interpreting the New Testament, arguing against that. I just published an article in Germany that really gave it as a paper to 20 professors, 10 of them Germans. They are very argumentative. I argued that Cornelius is not just a Gentile, he is a foreigner. He's an ethnic different person. And almost all of Luke and Acts are written to get that guy baptized, to take him into the church. So the way my reaction, bent too far toward, in the Myers-Briggs on the mental end of that, is to argue to other professors in my field, the way evangelicals read the Bible is just, that's not correct.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to persuade, nobody in Germany argued with me, actually. I've done this 50 years. We quibbled about whether Luke Acts is historiography, but they bought that, the situation in the Roman Empire is very close to ours, and Jesus in Luke 4 and Peter in Acts 10 they are talking to Christians saying we should be more open to foreigners, Samaritans, and yeah. That's the way, with my limitations and who I am, that's what I've done.
Okay. I think we've only just begun to touch on this discussion. There are many aspects to things that are going around in my head, and my wondering around how we as the church, we as Salt and Light Lutheran, we as people of God, how do we heal? How do we heal during this time? And what are we healing from? It is going to start with our inner work, but it doesn't mean because we are isolated from one another. It's because we are in relationship with one another, and whatever I experience inwardly, I'm expressing outwardly. Typically we have breakouts at time to talk with one another, and I think I don't have a question for us today, because we are all coming in this space in different places, with different needs, with different questions. So I'm wondering if maybe in our breakouts today, perhaps you take time to think about what are the questions arising within you? What are the feelings arising within you? And you don't have to say anything. Also, this is totally an opportunity to just sit and be with what's happening within you. Just a second here. I'm having a bit of a malfunction. But I want us to just take Take about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes to have our conversation today around what is going on and what am I feeling. And I'm not making the breakouts, one-to-one breakouts today. I'm making it so that we can have about 3 people, three people in a breakout today, so that we have some room for spaciousness. And if you don't wish to participate, you are more than welcome to stay in the main room. You do not have to join. And I think I've got everyone. There's at least 3 people in every breakout, okay? So I'm gonna open the rooms now. And we will have, we'll have about 8 minutes to just talk about whatever is on your heart, your mind, and whatever your questions are that arise. Who is this? Do *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Amy. My internet's going in and out, so.
Oh, hi, Amy.
Hi.
Marisol.
That was brave of David.
Hi, LaVeta.
Hi. Yeah,
Thank you for hosting this conversation.
Huh?
Thank you for hosting this conversation.
Well, it's an awkward conversation. And yet, for me, I really felt like I needed to have an understanding of how is it that racism has become so embedded in the religion that where I embrace like the ways of Jesus. It's hard for me. Huh?
I'm also wondering that.
And it's also, Marisol, it's like it also has impacted like my interactions with people in the world. Like I realize that when I'm with other Christian people who are really narrow in their view,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm talking about my Black brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
I realize it's like I think we're harming the world. We're not healing the world.
I agree.
You know, and I don't know. You grew up in Peru?
I grew up in Peru, and then I grew up in New York City.
Uh-huh.
And Peru is very, very diverse, but the neighborhood that I grew up in was very, very like white Hispanic. And my family itself is pretty mixed, but mostly like mestizo. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that kind of really struck me moving to New York and just learning more about race relations was how acceptable racist statements are in Peru and in Peruvian families. So
Really?
that's something that I've had to work to dismantle. So stuff around words that we use for like indigenous people or Black people or things we say about folks like that, even within our own families. After coming to New York and after like learning about history, civil rights and all of those things, I'm like, you know, just taking a look at my family in a different lens, starting to realize that some people in my family actually have African roots that we never even thought about or considered. And yeah, it's just kind of been an awakening for me. But I remember the question you asked, David, I remember like, what did you feel like the first time you interacted with like Black people? And I remember for me, the first time I saw someone that was like 100%, I guess, African-American or Black was in the New York City subway when I had first moved here. And for me, like the response was honestly just curiosity.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, those folks look really different. I've never seen that before. And I was just kind of staring. My mom's like, stop staring, you're gonna piss people off. And I'm like, I was just, you know, as a kid, I was just staring. And that, yeah, and that's just different, I feel. For me, it was just kind of curiosity. And then as I became a teenager, I think what was really weird and hard for me to kind of come to terms with is just, especially when it comes to like Hispanic people and Black people,